On a humid summer night in Memphis, a delivery driver claimed he heard music drifting from Graceland's closed-off second floor, the very part of the mansion that has been locked since Elvis Presley's death in 1977. It wasn't just any music. He swore it was the faint sound of a piano, playing the opening notes of Unchained Melody. Security guards were quick to check, but the room above remained sealed, dust settling on furniture that hadn't been touched in decades. Yet the driver stood firm. The notes were real, and they seemed to come from inside. That single moment set off a series of quiet whispers among neighbors and staff. People living near Graceland mentioned hearing faint singing late at night, often described as soft humming, never loud, but clear enough to raise goosebumps. Some even said it always happened close to 2 a.m., around the same time Elvis was known to pace his halls restlessly, struggling with insomnia. The tension deepens when we look at the evidence. An electrician, called in to work on old wiring in the mansion, logged unusual power surges in the main house, short spikes of energy that lined up almost perfectly with the night's neighbors reported hearing music. The spikes weren't long enough to trip circuits, but they were undeniable, showing up in the records like a faint signature. No one has ever gained access to the second floor to test the theory directly. It remains preserved exactly as it was the day Elvis died. But staff have tried small experiments, leaving audio recorders running in the halls, testing for outside interference, even checking if vibrations from nearby Beale Street clubs could somehow carry inside. None of the explanations fully lined up. The most unsettling account comes from a former night guard, who left his job after one shift. He described hearing slow footsteps in the upper hallway, right above where he stood in the lobby. Heavy, deliberate, and dragging slightly, as though someone was pacing in thought. When he radioed another guard outside to ask if anyone had entered, the reply was clear: "No one's gone in. You're the only one inside." When the story broke to a few local journalists, skeptics quickly offered explanations. Old wiring, pipes expanding at night, even the possibility of sound carrying strangely from tourists outside the gates. But there's one detail none of them could explain. The guard swore he saw a shadow shift across the landing of the staircase, even though the second floor lights have been turned off for decades. And that's where the mystery lingers. Not in sensational claims, but in fragments of real accounts. A song that no one should hear, power surges without cause, footsteps above locked doors. To this day, Graceland remains a place where millions visit each year. Yet the upper floor stays sealed, its silence carrying more weight than any ghost story ever could. The stories always began the same way, quietly, in whispers exchanged between neighbors or shared by former employees long after they had left Graceland. On the surface, Memphis treated Graceland like a shrine, a perfectly preserved capsule of Elvis Presley's life. But beneath that careful reverence ran a current of unease, something unspoken yet persistent, a shadow tied to the house itself. Those who lived near the estate often told each other that certain nights felt different. The neighborhood would fall into a kind of silence, the cicadas muting, the streets almost too still. That was when, they said, the faint sound of music would drift across the grounds. Never loud, never chaotic, just a low, rolling note, like the beginning of a gospel hymn. Sometimes it was piano, sometimes the echo of a voice, but always carrying the warmth and melancholy that had marked Elvis's late-night sessions. The odd part was how consistent the timing seemed. 2 in the morning. Over and over, reports matched. At first, neighbors assumed tourists were sneaking close to the gates, maybe playing old Presley songs as a kind of midnight tribute. But when security confirmed that the gates were locked and the cameras showed no movement on the street, the explanations began to lose weight. A few even admitted they had leaned against their bedroom windows, straining to hear, and realized the sound wasn't coming from outside at all. It was floating outward, from within the mansion's closed rooms. Inside the property, small disturbances were recorded over the years, though rarely acknowledged publicly. One security officer spoke in private about the surveillance cameras that occasionally glitched, only for a second or two, showing a faint static ripple across the feed. Each time it happened, the timestamp lined up with those same early hours, deep into the night shift when no one but the guards were awake. He said it unnerved him most because it never set off alarms. The house would remain still, the doors sealed, Yet the cameras seemed to protest against something they were being forced to witness. Visitors who had been allowed on limited after-hours tours described another unsettling detail: the air itself. In certain corridors, especially near the staircase leading to the forbidden second floor, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped slightly, not enough to be explained by air conditioning, but just enough to raise goosebumps. A hush settled in that space, as if the house itself held its breath when someone lingered too close to the staircase. More than one person admitted that when they stood there, they felt the peculiar pressure of being watched, though the hall was always empty. Then there was the electrician's testimony. Hired to stabilize the aging wiring in the early 2000s, he discovered what he later described as phantom surges. He showed his notes to a colleague. Faint bursts of power, short and sharp, occurring without any appliance running. He even charted the times, circled them, and they formed a pattern almost always aligning with the nights when neighbors heard faint music. He was not a superstitious man, but the numbers disturbed him. He said they looked almost like someone flipping a switch in a locked room. Perhaps the most chilling account came from a guard who lasted only one night on the job. He had been posted inside, his station set up in the lobby. Around 2:15 a.m., he heard footsteps. Slow, measured, and heavy, they creaked across the upper hallway directly above his head. He froze, certain another guard had entered without him noticing, but the radio check confirmed otherwise. The other officer was still outside at the gates. He described the steps as unmistakable, as though someone were pacing back and forth, dragging slightly on each turn. When he mustered the courage to look toward the staircase, he thought he saw a shadow move across the landing, broad-shouldered, unmistakably human, though the lights above had been off for decades. He resigned the next morning, refusing to stay another shift. No one who speaks about these things ever claims they are proof. They remain fragments, anecdotes, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. Skeptics dismiss the stories as tricks of sound, as old plumbing or the restless imagination of those who want too badly to believe. And yet, the persistence of these experiences creates its own kind of gravity. Too many separate voices, too many overlapping times and places. Graceland remains sealed, the second floor locked from the public, as though that single choice alone carries weight. For decades, staff have insisted it is to preserve the sanctity of Elvis's private quarters, untouched since the day he died. But those who have worked long nights inside tell a different version. They say the upstairs is closed not only to protect it, but to contain something. That if the doors were opened, the house might not be able to hold its silence anymore. The house, they whisper, is not empty. It listens. It waits. And sometimes, when the world is quietest, it remembers. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Graceland has always stood as more than a house. Tourists saw it as a museum, a pilgrimage site to honor Elvis Presley's legacy. But for those who lived around it, who saw the gates every day from their porches or drove past it on their way to work, the house was never simply an artifact of music history. Carried an atmosphere, something palpable. And over time, the stories began to weave into each other, small details adding up into a picture that grew harder to ignore. One of the earliest accounts came from a neighbor who had lived on Elvis Presley Boulevard since the early 1980s. She described how, late at night, she would sometimes step outside for air. On certain evenings, usually after midnight, she noticed a glow in the upstairs windows. Not bright enough to look like a lamp turned on, but a faint, flickering shimmer, almost like candlelight. It unsettled her because everyone knew the upstairs had been sealed off, preserved exactly as it was when Elvis died. No one was allowed in, not family, not staff, not even visiting dignitaries. Yet the glow would appear, soft and steady, before vanishing as if someone had blown it out. Security personnel, too, had their share of unexplainable moments. A guard admitted in confidence that he had grown used to hearing small disturbances, a door creaking in an empty hallway, the faint click of a piano key in the music room when no one was near. He dismissed most of it as the sounds of an old mansion settling into the night. But there was one incident he couldn't shake. While doing a routine patrol near the bottom of the staircase, he felt something odd, like a shift in the air, a slight pressure against his chest, as though he had walked into a wave of energy. At that exact moment, he heard what he swore was the sound of humming. Low, rhythmic, and distinctly human. He froze, convinced he was imagining it. But the sound lasted long enough to make him step back, almost retreating. Technicians working on the estate also noticed strange anomalies. In the early 2000s, when some of the older electrical systems were being updated, workers reported sudden spikes in current. The surges were small, barely strong enough to trigger equipment, but they always appeared in the logs during the same narrow window of time, between 1:45 and 2:30 in the morning. The timing unnerved one of the electricians, who had grown up listening to stories of Elvis's late-night routines. It was like the house kept its own schedule, he later said, half joking, half serious, like someone upstairs still couldn't sleep. Tour guides who worked in the house after hours spoke of a more subtle kind of disturbance, one that couldn't be measured on a chart. They described moments when silence grew too thick, almost oppressive, especially near the stairwell. Guests often lingered there, hoping to glimpse something forbidden about the closed-off second floor. But staff said it wasn't just curiosity that made people pause. It was the feeling that the house was holding its breath. More than one employee confessed they avoided that section entirely when locking up, preferring to take a longer route through the kitchen rather than pass the darkened stairs. There was even a night when a pair of guards both reported seeing movement at the same time. One was stationed outside near the gates, the other inside near the living room. Just after 2 in the morning, the outside guard radioed in, "Thought I saw someone in the upstairs window." Moments later, the guard inside, standing beneath that very section, reported hearing what he called 2 slow steps, measured and deliberate, above his head. When the two compared notes, the timestamps aligned within a minute. They never spoke of it officially, but both men resigned within months. Neighbors, employees, workers, each story by itself could be explained away. Pipes expanding in the night, old wood settling, faulty wiring, reflections from headlights on the road. Yet the repetition, the consistency, the way the details lined up, those were harder to dismiss. Graceland, for all its grandeur, seemed less like a museum and more like a vessel, a place that had absorbed too much life, too many sleepless nights, too much music echoing against its walls. It stood there, vast and silent, its gates locking out the world while the upstairs remained closed, untouched, sealed away. And for those who knew the stories, it was impossible to walk past the mansion at night without glancing up at those darkened windows, wondering if the house itself was guarding something the rest of us weren't meant to see. There was something about the upstairs rooms of Graceland that weighed heavier than the rest of the mansion. Even though no one had entered them in decades, people who worked nearby described feeling their presence, as though the second floor pressed down on the entire house. The staircase leading up was roped off, guarded not by locks or alarms, but by silence, a silence that felt deliberate, like a decision made long ago and never broken. Tourists snapped photos of the rope and leaned forward to glimpse the forbidden space, but staff always guided them away quickly, explaining the upper floor was private, preserved as Elvis had left it. Yet behind closed doors, the staff admitted it was more than preservation. One longtime worker, who had cleaned nearly every accessible room in the house for years, said that every time she vacuumed near the staircase, she felt watched. Not in a menacing way, but in a steady, unrelenting way, like someone standing at the top of the stairs, silently observing her work. She never told visitors, but she confessed to a coworker that she never lingered near the rope. She pushed the vacuum as fast as possible, keeping her eyes down, never daring to look up into the darkened hall above. The neighbors spoke of similar sensations, though from the outside looking in. A man who had lived across the street since the early 1990s told of nights when the curtains on the upper windows seemed to shift. He admitted he couldn't explain it. It could have been the wind, or shadows from passing cars, but the way the fabric moved suggested someone had brushed past it, as though a body had disturbed the stillness. Once, he swore he saw the faint outline of a figure, broad-shouldered, standing behind the curtain for a moment before fading into darkness. He never told the media, fearing ridicule, but his children grew up hearing the same story each time they asked why he never walked the dog past Graceland at night. Security logs offered their own fragments of the mystery. Records showed motion detectors tripping inside the house long after closing hours, but only in one section, the area near the staircase and upstairs landing. Each time, guards swept the property, checking every lock and window, but found nothing disturbed. Some chalked it up to technical malfunctions. Others weren't so sure, especially when the system was tested repeatedly and showed no errors. A former guard admitted that after 3 such incidents in 1 month, he stopped writing them in the official reports altogether, claiming it wasn't worth the questions that followed. Perhaps the most unnerving accounts came from those rare times when after-hours maintenance required tools near the upper floor. One carpenter, sent to reinforce a section of banister by the stairs, described hearing a faint rustle above him, as though clothes were shifting on a body that leaned against the railing. When he looked up, the hallway was black. He finished his work quickly, refusing to return even when offered more pay. He later told a friend, "It wasn't scary the way a movie makes you jump. It was worse. It felt like someone real was there, and you just couldn't see them." Even those who doubted the tales found themselves unsettled by coincidences. More than one neighbor swore that on certain anniversaries, Elvis's birthday in January, the day of his death in August, the strange activity grew stronger. Lights flickered upstairs, faint sounds of music drifted into the night air, and dogs in nearby yards barked furiously toward the mansion. One woman recalled sitting on her porch with her husband on an August evening, only to hear a sudden swell of what sounded like gospel harmony. It lasted no more than 30 seconds, but both of them heard it clearly. They sat in silence, neither wanting to admit what it might mean, until finally her husband muttered, "That was him. That was his voice." Skeptics always arrived with explanations: old wiring, air pressure shifts, tourists sneaking close with hidden speakers. But what unsettled those who lived nearest was not one isolated story, but the repetition. Different people, different years, all describing the same sensations. Footsteps above locked doors, humming in the halls, flickering lights in sealed rooms. The consistency gave the stories a weight that no single event could carry on its own. The house itself seemed complicit, as though it wanted to guard its secrets. Guides described how the atmosphere would change depending on the crowd. Some tours moved through without incident, cheerful and quick. Others felt bogged down, the air heavy, visitors whispering nervously as if afraid to break the quiet. One guide confessed she had seen guests stop in their tracks on the landing near the staircase, their eyes drawn upward by something unseen, only to shake their heads and continue as though embarrassed by what they felt. Graceland had always been a home of contradictions, part museum, part tomb, part shrine. But those who spent real time there came to understand it as something else entirely. A living presence, a memory that refused to let go. The rooms might be frozen in time, the furniture untouched, the bed upstairs never seen again by the public, but the atmosphere shifted, breathed, and reminded anyone who lingered too long that the house was not as silent as it seemed. And each night, at that hour when Elvis himself had once wandered sleepless, the stillness of Graceland grew sharp, alive, almost expectant, as though waiting for someone to notice. By the time the stories had circulated for years, Graceland had become something more than a tourist attraction. It was a paradox, a place meant to be celebrated for its history, yet surrounded by whispers that no guidebook could explain. The silence of the second floor loomed larger than any of the exhibits downstairs, and those who worked within the mansion began to feel that the very act of keeping it sealed was both a practical decision and an unspoken agreement with the house itself. The final testimony that seemed to bring the threads together came from a pair of security officers who had spent decades patrolling the estate. They agreed to speak only after their retirement, when they felt they no longer had anything to lose. Both described a particular night in August, during the week of the annual candlelight vigil held outside the gates. Tens of thousands of fans lined the street with flickering candles, singing Elvis's songs softly in unison. Inside the mansion, the officers patrolled in near darkness, the faint glow of the crowd visible through the curtains. Around 2 a.m., just as the singing outside swelled to "Can't Help Falling in Love," one guard swore he heard a piano begin to play upstairs. At first he thought it was the sound drifting in from the fans, but the notes didn't match. The piano was slow, hesitant, as though someone were practicing alone. The other guard, stationed in a different part of the house, radioed in almost immediately, "Do you hear that?" Both froze, listening to the faint melody rising from the sealed floor above them. They described the sound as fragile, as though played on an instrument long out of tune, but undeniably clear. It continued for several minutes, weaving between fragments of songs Elvis was known to play privately late at night. When it finally stopped, the silence felt so sharp it hurt their ears. They swept the house, checked the instruments downstairs, and found everything untouched. Both men resigned within a year, unable to reconcile their rational training with what they had experienced. The weight of such stories settled into the culture of Graceland itself. Employees passed them down quietly, never written into official logs but remembered all the same. Some claimed it was the energy of millions of visitors, the devotion of fans pouring into the house year after year, that created the strange phenomena. Others believed it was something simpler, the residue of a man who had lived so intensely, whose presence had been so overwhelming, that even death could not erase it from the rooms he once filled. For the neighbors, the unease never fully disappeared. On certain nights, the boulevard grew too still, as if waiting. A faint glow might appear in an upper window, or the muffled sound of a voice might drift across the lawns. Dogs barked toward the mansion, restless, pulling at their leashes. Residents learned to live with it, to stop asking questions, to accept that the house across the street would never be entirely silent. What makes Graceland's mystery compelling is not the theatrics of ghost stories, but the quiet accumulation of believable details. The footsteps that align with the hours Elvis once walked, the electrical surges matching moments when neighbors heard music, the guards who resigned after witnessing shadows and hearing songs no one should have been playing. Each incident alone might be explained away, but together they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. In the end, the second floor remains locked, preserved, untouchable. For tourists, it is a curiosity, a sacred part of Elvis's legacy held back from the world. For those who have worked in the house, it is something more, a threshold that no one dares to cross, not for fear of disturbing history, but for fear of what they might confirm if they did. Graceland stands quietly, its gates glowing with the lights of devotion, its rooms polished and open to millions, but its heart sealed away in shadow. At night, when the crowds leave and the boulevard grows still, the mansion returns to itself. And sometimes, in those hours past midnight, it seems to breathe again. The faint echo of a hymn, the steady rhythm of footsteps, the presence of a man who was never meant to be ordinary. Those who believe call it proof. Those who doubt call it coincidence. But everyone agrees on one thing: the house is never empty. It carries its own life, its own silence, its own unbroken vigil. And if you ever find yourself standing in the dark outside those iron gates at 2 in the morning, you might just hear it too. The sound of a voice, rising faintly through the stillness, singing to no one and everyone at once. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.